All right. Well, I guess we're just starting. Okay.
Yeah, man, go for it.
All right. Well, that's awesome. So this is actually my first call out debate. The resolution we're given to debate is that competition at an early age is detrimental for children. So I'm just going to present kind of what I believe the weighing mechanism, the definitions. And if you have any opposition to that, we can talk about that, and then I'll get into my arguments. All right. For competition, we're just going to use a layman's term definition, the activity of competing. In this instance, we can assume it's competing against other children, right? Detrimental, we can just simply define as harmful. At an early age, I think it's legitimate to say like sub-teenage years, like 10 or younger, like adolescents, young children. And then I think the burdens of this round is quite simple. For me to win, I have to prove that, overall, there's more harm that comes from children being exposed to competition and in competition at an early age than good. Not necessarily that there's no benefits or vice versa. With that in mind, I'll just pass to you if you have any objections to those.
No, that all sounds pretty good. The only thing which kind of took me by surprise is that your early age is quite broad in scope. I thought that you'd be more talking about like toddlers and stuff, but I'm totally fine to do whatever. It's one of those kind of weird.
I want to give space to debate, right?
Yeah. No,
I didn't want to go set it too low and then just there'd be like some sort of,
no, it's all good. That, so. The other thing I just quickly put in as well is that we should probably characterize the form of competition which kids are likely to engage in at that age. So we're unlikely to, for example, pit them against each other in some sort of stocks and bonds trading mission where they're trying to steal money off each other. They are more likely to do things like compete in, for example, primary school versions of debate. They might do things like team sports. They might also just do games within themselves and like tag and stuff like that, where there is obviously clear, not necessarily winners and losers, but there are people who are winning the game, right? So that's what we're talking about. But other than that, yeah, I agree that obviously there will be harms and benefits. It's just a matter of weighing overall qualitatively which who comes down top. So with that said, I'll pass it to you to get started on your points.
All right, awesome, great. And yeah, I forgot to mention that. That's going to be like my first contention is quite simply competitive sports. And the idea of this contention is to look at the basis that the majority of times kids are going to be in competition in sports, usually more contact like soccer or at that early age. That's like one of the most common. But in general, I think you can tag my A sub point under this as body is still developing. Now, the U.S. Library of Medicine and Science specifically released a study talking about what is the effect of like young adult sports. And I can add this link into the description if you want. And it says, quote, that during adolescent years, some athletes may experience a decrease in flexibility, coordination, and balance, which not only increases the risk of injury, but also impacts sports performance and presses more stress, anxiety, and social pressure on a young athlete. The obvious impact here is like for the most common youth sports like soccer, right? Or I guess football for the majority of the world. In that instance, there's a high chance of injury. And at a young age, you have that problem because the body is still developing. And inherently like your skeletal structure, right? Any permanent damage that might come out, any damage can easily be permanent because your body's still developing. There's some serious risks that are put at place when you open kids up to that competition. With that said, my B point is quite simply that the youth sport culture fails to protect. Now, again, quoting from the same study, it says, quote, that although not all injuries can be prevented, it appears that youth sport culture is failing in minimizing both traumatic and overuse injuries in children. Parents, coaches, sports medicine professionals, and organizers are all culpable. Despite the fact that 67% of injuries occur during practice session, many parents enforce fewer safety precautions during these times than during competition. It's quite simple, the idea that, in this area, this culture is created of like youth sport culture. There isn't that much protection for the children in the case of like serious, injuries or stuff. And that's a serious problem. But that's not really the crux of my case. The second contention or line of argument that I'd like to make is that adolescents aren't matured enough. They're not matured enough. And we can see this again in two subpoints. Firstly, and that is the A point of that of an unhealthy climate. Now, to understand this, we're going to look at, in general, kids 10 or below in that wide range are reached into a climate of competition. Now, competition, the inherent climate presented is winning. Winning is kind of the end goal. And the problem is winning doesn't necessarily build character. To a kid, a very young age child, there's such a one-track mind that their major focus on is winning, right? And they don't think about the process there because their mind hasn't developed that much. They haven't really, in a sense, matured enough to reach that level, right? Because that's their focus. And when winning is set as the focus, and although that may be appropriate for later on in their life, at an early age when kids are still figuring out what's right, what's wrong, like what is appropriate, activities, what is appropriate to be in public, their reactions and how they go through this shouldn't be exposed to them too early, because it's too much of a high pressure environment. The subpoint B is really an extension of that. They don't really have a real capacity, right? They don't have a capacity to understand maturity. When kids 10 years or younger, or in general, which is the majority of those kids in the sports area, or just in general intense competition, do not have the mental capacity to make these decisions. And with that, I rest my case and pass it over to you, Ben.
All right, cool. Well, look, I'll go through that list of contentions and then introduce one of my own.
Awesome.
First thing you've said on sports is that there's risk of injury, and basically you're supporting things that the body is still developing. What I would say here is that I actually think the problem is not with competition. It's what you pointed to earlier about a lack of rules enforcement. So unless you can strictly tie those two together, right, that competition necessarily leads to lack of rules enforcement, then the problem is not loaded on competition. The problem is loaded on the exact type of sport which we're talking about. So, for example, some sports like netball are equally competitive to a sport like football, but carry vastly less risk of injury. So what that suggests is that the moving variable there is actually, for example, the rules of the sport, not the competitive element of the sport. Similarly, for example, I could get even more extreme and talk about things like lawn bowls, or even within football, right? You have, for example, football, then you have touch football, and then in Australia, you have something called Oz tag, where you have to, pull tags off the other person. All of those sports are equally competitive. Like, there's still high stakes in winning and losing. There's still, winners, there's still goals to be scored, and most of the game functions exactly the same. It's just the slight differences also permeate the rules. Another good example of this would be gridiron in the US, is loaded with safety gear. Whereas in Australia, when the professional athletes go for it, they're really like just throwing their bodies at each other. That's another example of sports which are quite similar, but for the fact that there are different safety rules around them. So what that points to at the end of the day is that the problem there about risk of injury is actually not loaded on the competitive element of the sport. It's loaded on the rules of the sport and the safety precautions taken. Second thing I point out, though, as well, that I actually disagree that kids are at a greater risk of injury, because whilst you're right that their skeletal structure might still be developing, they're also just not as strong. So, for example, think about how many injuries happen to professional athletes versus and the types of injuries versus the types of injuries for kids. Because with kids, sure, right, their skeletal structure is a little bit, less, but they can't bench press anything, right? Like, yeah, when a kid throws it themselves at another kid, it's like, oh, well, like whatever, they, rough and tumble on the ground. It's very different when you're an adult, right? Where the person being thrown at you actually has the strength to, like put a dent in the brick wall. That's where the real risk of injury occurs. So if you really actually were concerned about risk of injury, you would actually say that it should be adults not competing as opposed to children, where they're not strong enough to impose any serious damage on each other. The next thing you said was about stress and anxiety. I'd like to point out that the sort of stress and anxiety you experience as a teenager is true of literally every teenage experience you have. It is true of school tests. It is just true of socializing. It is true of when you try and get your first girlfriend or your first boyfriend. And that's like an immovable thing. That's got nothing to do with competition. That's just because you're a moody teenager. And so, in fact, what I would suggest is that having an outlet where you can learn how to deal with those in a healthy environment, such as sports, such as competition, is actually a good thing. Because what happens is that the stress and anxiety doesn't go away. People just get braver dealing with it. And where you get braver dealing with it is by confronting it in an environment such as sport. The culture stuff, I actually disagree that the culture isn't great around sports. I think lots of parents are highly motivated to protect their children. And it is often an outrage when children get seriously injured by sports, which is why they tend to have higher safety regulations than adult sport. Last thing I'm going to talk about, which will integrate nicely with my point, is about they're not mature enough. I think your case is really premised on this idea of child learning, that what happens is that if you just leave kids without teaching them anything, they grow more and more mature, and then you can suddenly introduce concepts to them. That's not true. Kids mature because they learn from their experiences. And what they learn valuable lessons from sports, such as that it's not all about winning. So, for example, you may have heard the expression, it's not about whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. That is something which every child hears in their life in multiple instances, because the idea that sport is not just about winning. And that's why you have, for example, men of the match and stuff like that, which is not just awarded to the highest goal scorer, but to someone who's, the best team player. There are other idioms such as there's no I in team, which shows that actually there is more to sport than just winning. And this is where I introduced the first positive material I have, which is that competition is essential for teaching kids how to cooperate, because every form of competition only works if you are all cooperating under the same rules by itself. So, for example, you're playing soccer. Yes, you're competing to win, but nobody picks up the ball with their hands and runs with it, right? The reason is because they're learning how to cooperate, how to play a shared game by the same rules whilst competing over those rules. The competition sure makes it very fun to do that, but the actual skill they're learning is cooperation, and they're using competition as a vehicle to teach that. And I think we can both agree that cooperation is a net positive for child development. With that said, I'll pass it over to you for your responses the next point.
Good. Awesome. I think you made some great points. I first want to address something when you talked about stress and anxiety, and I think you were talking about teenagers in general, about how teenagers will undergo stress and anxiety. I completely agree that teenagers go through a lot of crap, but the point here we're not talking about, correct me wrong, just to clarify, your point is that we are preparing them to go through this? Is that your position?
Yeah, not just preparing, but also that my point is that it's not like the sports cause the stress and anxiety. The stress and anxiety is a given. The question is, how do you get someone to be able to deal with it? It's either via, yes, preparation, or B, when you're going through it, being able to go through a sports game, realize that you lost and it wasn't the end of the world, so that you just get better at dealing with stress and anxiety generally.
Okay. So all right, I'll just move on and respond to your points then. To your first point, your first contention, though, talking about competition is essential to create cooperation. I would point out that inherently not all competition, as you yourself said, when we talk about framework, has to be in a team. For example, debate, like what we're doing, is one-on-one. That competition doesn't necessarily promote. It's not a universal principle you're promoting. We're talking about competition in general. Competition promotes the idea of competing to try and win. The purpose of competition, right, is to try and win, to try and best your opponent. In that sense, you can have multiple areas of competition at a young age, or in general, like golf, tennis, chess, debate, whatever, many different areas that aren't actually working together as a team. You can have cooperation without competition. You can have competition without cooperation. Neither of them require each other. So I wouldn't say that you need competition for cooperation. You could learn how to build something with somebody out of Legos, and that be cooperation, right? Working together with somebody else. And right there is an example of how competition wasn't needed to promote creativity or promote imagination. Your point about, there being no strength, my response would be, there being no real strength. In your response to my A point about bodies being hurt and stuff, my response would be quite simply proportional strength. And the understanding of this is like, sure, they wouldn't do much damage to somebody like us, but a 10-year-old smashing their head into another 10-year-old's head might actually do some damage because they themselves both don't have very developed skull structures. So I understand the idea that, sure, they don't have objective strength compared to adults, but we're talking about kids, like getting into injuries with other kids in sports, right? In that area, we can see that it's proportional. So you don't need as much strength to hurt a small child. Your point about competition doesn't really drive that. It's the rules of the sport. My simple response would be that aggressiveness drives that factor. Aggressiveness drives that factor. The entire idea of kids getting hurt in sports we can agree, is probably almost exclusively due to aggressiveness. Like getting excited, like the most common example is two kids get excited, they accidentally do something, they might run into each other. I mean, that's like probably the most common example I think we can agree. And why does that happen? Because there's this fuel, there's this excitement, because they haven't learned how to deal with these feelings yet. And and the idea of learning sports and stuff, I think would be better under just a cooperative environment. That right here is an example of this aggressiveness that is triggered, like it's almost an animalistic instinct. That's what creates this competition. All right, that's what competition creates. So yeah, the sport may be lenient toward that aggressiveness, but the aggressiveness comes from competition. And your final point about kids and your teenager, about kids learn because of maturing. Again, I think I kind of addressed this in my cooperation point. You can learn things without having to use competition. You can learn how to work together with people. You can learn how to mature and have your parents or something introduce you to those ideas. My point isn't that kids should never have competition. My point is, at an early age, below 10 years old, that age is just not appropriate for them. It's too dangerous, or it's just, in general, they don't have the mental capacity. So yes, kids mature in many instances by learning, but you can learn things with cooperation. And eventually, yes, you should be exposed to competition, but not in an early age. I believe I hopefully respond to all your arguments.
Yep. Oh, cool. Okay, so I guess I'll hit back on some of the points. First thing about cooperation. So I think you've assumed incorrectly so that my cooperation was only relevant for teams. It's not just that you cooperate with your team. Even in individual sport, you have to cooperate with your opponent. So for example, you use debate as a structure here. I could, if I wanted to, cut you off one word through every sentence. right? Just put my hands in my ears and blah, blah, blah. And I could, swear and just make completely nonsensical arguments. But that would ruin the debate for both of us. And no one would then want to debate with me again. So I actually not just have to cooperate with a team, even without a team, I have to cooperate with my opponent, my enemy, right, in order to make the game functional. And also not to just win that game, but to then win the set of games, right? Because what really constitutes winning in a game is that if people want to invite you back and play with you again. And kids know that more than ever, right? They want to be invited to the next birthday party. They want when recess goes off that everyone wants to play tag with them or wants to play basketball or whatever. So cooperation is not just to teams. Cooperation is also with your enemies, which is a particularly valuable lesson to learn because it says that even when you're pitted against somebody, that you have to have common rules. And you can imagine, for example, the implications of that when they grow into adults and if they have to make positions of responsibility over, if God forbid they're in politics, for example, and they have to make those sorts of decisions. Next thing is you said you don't need competition to learn cooperation. I have two responses. The first is that I actually disagree. I think, for example, you're going to have a very hard time just getting kids to build stuff together. And I think the way society is speaks for itself on that. So, for example, the things which are very popular, which we like to watch and we like to participate in, are competition driven. And that is because, and it might be appear like a little bit of a naturalistic fallacy, that I strongly believe that there is a competitive instinct within us, which really gets satiated by competition. And for example, I don't know what your background is, but I often teach kids, right? And if you, for example, give the kids all a task to build things in groups, and then if you tell them, and the person who builds the tallest structure, or the person whose structure, survives all these tests, gets a prize or is the winner, then suddenly their productivity picks up like 200%, right? Because they all are highly motivated. And what I would say there is that competition is a good motivator to sort of encourage healthy behavior, which kids would otherwise not voluntarily do. I'll get back to that in a moment in another positive point. Before I'm just going to do that, I'm just going to address the second response to that. Second response is that even if it's not necessary to gain cooperative skills, that doesn't actually mean that you're winning any points there. So for example, I could say that vegetables are a net positive for your health. You could say, well, you don't need vegetables to be healthy, but that doesn't mean that vegetables aren't still healthy. We're merely assessing if competition is net positive or negative. We're not necessarily saying, is it the only way you can get those positive benefits? So even if it's a redundant form of benefit, it's still a big benefit because it's still net positive use for learning cooperation when you do it. The next thing you said was on safety. So basically you said, well, the thing which competition brings out is aggression. And I would say that is true, but that aggression is still there even if you don't do competitive things. I think it's important that kids learn where their limits are, right? And so what the competition often does is it puts rules around aggression, right? It says that, yes, this level of aggression is acceptable, and if you go too far, then that's unacceptable. It says that these sorts of tackles are okay, but these ones are unsafe. And that's really important that kids actually learn to straddle that line. And yes, do make mistakes sometimes because people never really learn what their limits are until they break them. And unfortunately, competition often puts us in the environment where we can break those limits with minimal harm happening because there is safety gear on hand, right? There are people looking out and there are refs and there are coaches to say, okay, this is what you did right and this is where it went too far. That's better than, for example, when you punch someone for the first time or when you tackle someone for the first time in a fight, right? And you've never done anything like that before. That's a disaster. That's where that aggression goes unchecked. And so you really want that aggression to come out in an environment which is supervised and where there are rules and stuff around it first. The next thing you said was about proportionality. I just think that I think we both made logical, sensible cases here, right? That kids are weaker, but maybe their bodies are less resilient. I would again just point to the empirical evidence on this, which is look to the frequency and severity of injuries in adult sport versus the frequency and severity of injuries in child sport. Adult sport has something like, where 50% or more football players experience a concussion in their lifetime once they get to the college level or above. And that is because ultimately, yes, your bones get kind of stronger when you're adult, but your muscles grow at a much faster rate, right? And so at the end of the day, yes, it is proportional, but kids, you just hear about a lot less disastrous injuries. No one's ever maybe I want to say no one, but I have heard of very few people actually dying in kids' sports. Where I've certainly heard, for example, there's a very famous Australian cricketer who got a ball bowled at him at 100 k's an hour. Like no kid can ever do anything even close to that, even if their bones are a little bit more fragile. The next thing I'm just going to quickly touch on is about when you were talking earlier when I was talking about how competition is a necessary motivator for otherwise hard things to do. I think competition eases socialization in a really big way because particularly when you're a kid or just an awkward person, it can be very difficult to socialize with someone for the first time. There are very few cues as what to do, like you say, what's your name? And then you say, what's your name? But if there's a set framework, right, where there's something which both of you can do and there's rules which you can both follow and there's a drama you can both play out, then you can actually have a quite meaningful engagement like we are having here, the two of us, despite the fact that we have never met before. That's what competition does. It incentivizes and puts structures around the way which people can socialize to ease otherwise quite awkward and quite uncomfortable scenarios where people will just kind of look the other way and stick to themselves. So with that said, that's my second point made and my other points defended, and I'll pass it back to you.
All right, awesome. I have simply one question. Are you under 10 years old?
No.
Awesome. I'm happy to learn that.
I have been doing this since I was 10, though.
All right, that's great. All right, so let's jump right into your arguments. First off, you talk about how we need cooperation. You know, you have to cooperate with your opponent, which I agree. But the idea that sure, you have to cooperate with your opponent, but the idea that you need to learn cooperation, you have to have competition is inherently false. I can learn to cooperate with my siblings without having to compete with them in building something. I agree. Competition is a great motivator. It's really good. And some people really excel into that. Some people don't. But especially at an early age, under 10 years old, kids who have not learned what's right, what's wrong, haven't learned what's appropriate, how to act, need to learn in a sort of a safety net. And the idea is the safety net of cooperation. After 10 years old, I'm totally fine. The point is that early on, when they're still figuring out what's right and what's wrong, their parents should be talking with them, and parents should having them cooperate with other kids to kind of teach them ideology. I would love to see kids learn competition, but not at such an early age. That is my position. Secondly, you talk about, you know, how it teaches a valuable lesson. I think this applies there. Yes, it teaches a valuable lesson. But again, the entire point, which I don't think you've directly responded to, is that these children are still figuring out what's right and what's wrong. It teaches a valuable lesson. But the question is, do they need to learn that lesson at 8 years old, 7 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old? And I guess that's your position. Moving on, we can talk about, you know, how we have a competitive instinct. I agree. I think a lot of people, if that's not naturally, at least a majority of people will have a competitive instinct in them, especially us guys. I would agree. Your point later, but I don't necessarily see how that's important for us to indulge in our own naturalist instincts at 10 years old. For example, naturalist instincts might say, well, I should just take this toy because I want it at like 6 years old, because that's like, I don't know any better. I don't know what's right or wrong. I need to learn those things in a safe environment, and one that's less risk-free, and one that in that instance, you get that point. Moving on, you talked about how vegetables and how, well, we don't need vegetables technically to survive. Therefore, you know, we shouldn't have them. It's not my position that we don't need competition. Competition is great. I love competition. That's kind of why we're here. We're kind of having a friendly competition right now. But the thing is, neither of us are 10 years old. As you talked about how, look at what competition does. It brings people together. It's such a great motivator. Look at us coming together. But the important thing to note is neither of us are 10 years old. I've seen 10-year-olds try to debate. It is painful. It's terrible because they don't know how to act or what's appropriate or inappropriate. And a lot of times it will devolve into calling each other names because they haven't had the emotional maturity enough to develop and reach a point where they understand what is socially appropriate, what is appropriate, how we should follow rules. That's something that their parents have to go through them at an early age. I believe I respond to all your points, so I pass the mic back to you.
All right. Cool. So I'll just go through from top to bottom. The first thing you said with competition, cooperation, is do you need competition to teach cooperation? I would point out that this is not the point. So, for example, if the debate, just insert the word beans, right, like as a food. If the debate was that beans at an early age are detrimental for children, and I said, well, beans are really healthy, you know, you could say, well, like, you know, you don't need beans for your vegetable intake, or you could have broccoli, right? That doesn't mean that beans are detrimental. That just means that they are another good thing. So for you to point out that it is unnecessary does not prove detrimental. It just proves it is another good thing. So that point really falls flat when you analyze the burdens of emotion. The next thing is that the question is, do you need it? I described it as a motivator. And what I would say here is that competition is a motivator like no other. And you can just, I guess, all we can do is ask the audience to kind of search themselves and ask themselves whether this is true. It is certainly true as my experience teaching kids. But I think we agree that there is some sort of natural instinct there, which makes it a good motivator. But generally speaking, I just think, you know, there's a lot of joy in winning. There's a lot of joy in learning. There's a lot of joy in cooperating with friends and having it making it, putting it in the frame of sports. And we've seen how like popular sports gets and how everyone likes them so much. Like when you go and tell the kids we're not doing math anymore, we're going to go outside and we're going to play sports, they will jump for joy, right? And that I just think it kind of speaks for itself how good of a motivator that is, because it's very easy, by the way, for kids to just opt out. Like, say you want to teach them cooperation in another way, and you want to say we're going to build blocks together. Some kids just won't do it. A lot of kids just won't come out of their shell unless they're prompted to by the right sort of stimuli. And my contention is that competition is that stimuli. The next thing is about this the natural. Actually, I'll go to natural instincts, and you're talking about how we can't beat them all. So, for example, there's an instinct to steal because you want something. What I would say is that there's also an instinct not to make enemies with everyone you encounter. And so in that sense, you've got two different instincts against each other. And that, I think, is exactly the sort of environment competition creates, because competition creates an environment where you have to cooperate with your enemies enough that they want to play the game with you and that they'll invite you to play again. But you also want to compete with them so that you can win in that localized game. And straddling that balance is difficult and something that you have to learn. The overall theme of your case is that you seem to believe that children will just learn things naturally as they go older. But I think that's backwards. And this is where I'll transition onto the age thing. It's not like you get to a certain age and you realize what right and wrong is. It's actually that you act out right and wrong generally before you even know what the abstract terms right and wrong really are. And you just kind of know them in terms of a drama. So, for example, there's a well-known phenomenon that with children, if you, particularly young ones, like quite young, where this debate is about, they can play, if you put them all together and you say play tag, they can play tag, or, insert game here, bull rush or whatever. But if you ask an individual to explain the rules of the game to you, they're totally unable to do so. They'll all come up with different ideas about what the rules are, but you put them together and they can play it. What does this tell you? It tells you that you learn how to act things out before you learn how to speak and articulate things and think of things in abstractions. And you can think about this. I don't know if anyone's, I teach math, but it's definitely true of anyone who's been in a maths class. Think about how many times, for example, someone's just explained the theory to you and you've been like, right, got it. Versus how many times you've learned like a simple way of doing the maths equation, and you kind of learn, via rote or just via practice, something without really knowing the full theory behind it. And then afterwards, the theory is explained to you given the context of the thing you've already been doing. And that's because we're quite humans are tool orientated, right? That like we act things out. And what competition does is it allows people to act out the morality, act out the right and wrong, without having to learn the abstractions first, which is particularly why you need to do it for young children, right? Because young children don't have the capacity to articulate things. They need to learn how to act it out. And unless you want to say, for example, why I just believe that children from 0 to 10 should be completely amoral creatures, I don't think that's a good solution. I think that children need to learn morality from an early age, because if they don't, how are you going to teach them when they're older? Like, part of what makes teaching right and wrong easier is that you can analogize it to all the past experiences they've had with competition, that they know all the idioms. They know that it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game. They know there's no I in team. They know they can remember experiences in their own life where the time which they took their competition too far alienated them from their friends, right? Or, that the time, which the other kid did it, which they were the cast out, or maybe they've had, some bit too aggressive to them before. They need to experience those things to make it easier to learn them. So that's why you need at a young age, in particular, kids to do that. So, for example, with debating, I actually find that kids actually tend to be overly polite with debating. When you're older, that's where people start dropping F-bombs and start getting really aggressive and start calling each other names. Kids, they rigidly stick to formalities. They're always like, my opposition brought up some good points, but I think I found a few flaws. Like, kids learn those structures to the absolute bone. They learn how to over-dramatize respect. And what that means is that they learn how to act out what is right before it can be explained to them rationally why you need to do this. They just learn that those are the rules, so that then when they learn the actual right and wrong, they can analogize it to their past experiences. The last thing I'm going to point out as a substantive point is that competition is just a good period because all of life is competitive. At the end of the day, when you try to go for your school certificate, I don't know what it's called in America. It's probably called your UMAT or your USAT or something. When you try and go for a job, when you're even vying, with another person you're both into the same person and you want to get their attention, life is competitive. There is barely a single facet in life which is not competitive in some way. And you need to be able to practice that out from your early age. You need to be able to get used to the fact that competition is okay. You need to lose a lot. You need to lose and learn that it's okay. You need to have someone break the rules against you and then forgive them and realize that that is something to do. You need to do all of those things when you're young so that you can then learn to do them as you're old, because there will be no choice but to do them when you're old. And to start that education process at past age 10, in my opinion, is not a good idea. With that said, I'll pass back to you.
All right. I'm actually really interested to debate these kids from Australia. You keep talking about how polite they are. I have unfortunately not had that experience. But anyway, getting on to your points. You talked about how you're correct me if I'm wrong, but the tag for your first contention was that competition is essential for cooperation, right?
Yeah.
All right.
It's useful for teaching cooperation.
Okay, useful. All right, cool. That was a misunderstanding. I thought you were saying that it was essential. All right. With that in mind, so I think we can both agree that cooperation is beneficial then, right?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So you present this idea that competition is useful to create competition. And you talk about how competition is something we learn right and wrong. I would disagree. I think cooperation can teach you right or wrong as well. When you talk about this idea of how we have to learn to work with people and follow sets of rules, if you're in a social environment, right, where you have to work with another kid and you're 8 years old and you're building something, or, you go through the same thing without being competitive. Like, you want the kid to play with you, but you're not like competing in that play. So you have to learn how to be nice. You have to learn how to deal with that. That right there is an example of cooperation. What I'm saying is that the idea that competition is effectively the way we use to learn is not necessarily, or the way to cooperation is not necessarily true. Competition is important. I'm for kids getting competition, but not at such an early age, because you can achieve the same learning of, social graces, what's right and wrong within a cooperative environment, right? You learn it's not okay to take things from other kids when you're playing with them, right? You learn those things usually, hopefully, because there's hopefully parents around. I would hope that the parents are watching their kids. But the idea there is quite simple, is that all the benefits you just stated from competition right there about learning right and wrong and morality can be gained from cooperation. So the idea that competition benefits those is non-unique. Secondly, we talk about how again, this also cross-applies to your point about how they learn their limits. You talk about how it's such a great motivator. I completely agree. This goes back to my point about it also motivates aggressiveness. It motivates learning. Yes, it's great at motivation, but in an early age, not so much. Early age kids, not all kids want to compete against each other. You talk about this idea that we learn things best through competition. I would disagree. Many different learning styles. For example, I learn things through either hearing them or through doing them. I'm an audio kinesthetic learner. I learn through hearing. Some people learn visually. Some people learn through reading information. My brother, Ben, he is an insane speed reader. He can read anything and completely understand it. And that's the way he learns information. Some kids who are developing their learning styles, yes, many kids will learn by doing something, right? I agree that a lot of instances that's true. But the idea that is naturalist instinct, that we have to experience those to learn something, I don't think is true, because I think there's many different learning styles. Which one is the most prevalent is irrelevant. Moving on, again, you go down, you talk about how competition is required in life. I agree. I agree that competition is required at a later stage in life. When you're 6, 7, 8 years old, you're not going to have to worry about competing for a girlfriend unless you're a really serious 6, 7, 8-year-old. And in that area, it's not required. But what is required is learning what's right and wrong. And that can come about through the inherent benefits of cooperation. So yes, I agree to your point that I don't have to necessarily prove that I can't just prove that competition, though, is just not needed. I have to prove that it's actually bad. And this goes back to my main points. Firstly, that kids in an environment of winning inherently promotes bad morals. Because if at a kid at such an early age who doesn't have a moral foundation, is the goal to win something, does not promote good things. Bad things come from that because they don't have an understanding of social graces and stuff yet. Inherently, it also promotes aggressiveness, which at an early age, I think we both agree is generally not a good idea. In that area, it has to be pointed in the right direction, right? Your aggressiveness has to go in the right direction. In an early age, most kids don't have control of their aggressive nature. I know I didn't. I was a terrible kid. I feel bad for my parents. But in that instance, I didn't learn things at that age through competing with other kids. In fact, that's how I got worse, because my goal that I set in my mind was entirely I want to win. I want to win. I will do anything to win because that's what's most important. And it it didn't register because I didn't understand that that's not how things work. That sometimes you have to cooperate with people, and at an early age, cooperation would have taught me way more valuable lessons. With that, I think I respond to your points. Hopefully, I did. I'm starting to get a bit convoluted, and I pass the mic.
All right. So first thing I point out about this uniqueness point. So, for example, the way your point goes is that you say, well, look, sure, competition can teach cooperation, but so can just straight cooperation. So therefore, it's non-unique. I'd point out that that actually is a double-edged sword, because that also then applies to cooperation, right? Like if there are two ways to learn something, then your criticism of competition works just as well against cooperation, because you can do it via either means, which is why I point out it's not really that important in this debate, because the question of the motion is not you need competition to learn cooperation. The debate is just, is competition good or bad? If we agree that cooperation is a good thing and that there are two ways to learn it, then both of those things are good because they are both useful ways to learn a good thing. It doesn't need to be the only way to be a good way. And again, I'll point to you, for example, the vegetables analogy, right? There are many foods which make you healthy. That doesn't mean that all of the individual ones are detrimental, because there are others. There are just lots of good ones. So the uniqueness thing isn't actually a real point. But also, I'd actually ask you a few questions here about this stuff about building things, because my experience is that kids actually make things competitive when they're not. So, for example, if kids are building things and then the kids start to have a bit of a conflict over whose idea of the building should be the right one, and they start to argue, compete, if you will, over whose vision of the building is the best one, would you as a teacher stop that conversation, or would you allow them to try and negotiate that out?
Within the presence of the resolution, I would clearly stop them and remind them that the purpose of the building is they're not here to argue. They're here to agree and try and get on a compromise, because inevitably having them fight it out, although that might be beneficial in later age to learn what you believe in and what is important to you in general, at a later age, at an early age, it's not actually that beneficial, because what you're promoting is that some people will be winners and some people will be losers. And that doesn't promote that just, as earlier, promotes stress and anxiety. Did you drop out of the call?
No, I'm still here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's just your camera dropped.
Oh, okay, right. But the point is, if you're good in compromise, it's still competitive, right? Because you still have to lobby for your ideas. And by the way, I think that self-advocacy is very important. Kids need to be able to feel that, yes, I can speak up for what I believe in, and that's okay. And it's not like inherently offensive to have my own beliefs. So surely you wouldn't tell the kids that they should just give the other kid all of their, everything they want. Surely you would say that they should believe in themselves and try and reach a compromise, but with a bit of dignity along the way. Surely you'd be okay with that.
I think that there's room, and I think it's very situational. In this instance, I don't see the necessary harm in that. But again, what we're talking about is overall, and I would point back to the resolution. It's kind of more of a net beneficial. So yeah, you can say in that instance, there could be an example of some different, it really depends on the children. Some children will react beneficial to competition, some children won't.
Okay, well, look, what I'd say here is that I think what this point shows is that even under your at best view, cooperation is just another good way to learn these skills, but competition is a very good way as well. So they are both beneficial. But I think at worst, I might be right at pointing out that even the most cooperative activities often turn competitive, even within a cooperative framework. And in that environment, it is actually beneficial to let the kids compete and advocate for themselves, because that is just going to be essential for building self-esteem and going to be beneficial for doing things like negotiations. The next thing you talked about was how it is as a motivator. You said that it's not a motivator at a young age, because some kids are competitive, but some kids aren't. What I like to point out there is that is not an argument that this is not net beneficial, right? Because just because only some kids are a certain learning style doesn't mean that you would never, ever teach a learning style, which not all kids do, right? What I would say is that actually the best way to do it is, you've got kids who are, heterogeneous in their learning styles, then surely the right strategy is to offer up the full gamut and platter of all of the ways they could learn, so that the ones who are receptive to certain types of learning have that option. What your thing would allow you to do is to say, well, listen, if not all kids learn in a way, we shouldn't teach it because some will be left out. I've got news though, there are no learning styles like that. There aren't any universal learning styles. If anything is close to universal, it's the motivation to competition. It's the motivation to believe in oneself. So I actually think that is not a reason as to why competition is not net beneficial. It says that it's beneficial for a lot of people, but not beneficial for all of them. That is still on net a lot, very, very beneficial, and you should still offer it as an option. The next thing you're saying is that about later life. You're saying, oh, well, look, yeah, sure, you need competition later in life, but kids don't need to do that now. Well, for a start, I would ask you, should kids learn math at school? right? What if, like, because not all math you need straight away when you're a kid, right? So should kids learn math and English, which are building blocks for later life, you reckon?
Oh, sure. I would say they should, because math and English inherently present two things: that of logic. Math and English both teach the same thing, that it both teaches how to logically analyze information and how to deal with that. That is what math and English do. So yes, I would say that could be an example.
So what you're saying is that even if the individual skill is a bit pointless, the generalizable attitude towards things like logic and analysis are a reason enough for that individual thing to be beneficial. Am I understanding that correctly?
I would say that I'd say math is, especially at an age that we're talking about, is incredibly foundational and is important. Like, to understand how to speak in your diction, I think that's important. To understand basic, subtraction, addition, multiplication, whatever you learn in that small area, I think is very foundational and very important. The skill at that age. I mean, if we're going to talk about like algebra and calculus, one can argue that, but at an early age, the subjects that would be taught are very foundational. So I would.
No. So, for example, I teach math. Not all of it is foundational for stuff which they can do straight away. So, for example, kids will rarely need to know what the names of polygons are past, like, a rectangle, right? You don't need to know what a pentagon and a hexagon and an octagon is, right? Like, there's nothing there. What there is what you pointed to, right? There's that logical way of thinking, that idea of categorization. So, would you be against, for example, teaching polygon theory to kids?
See, I know where you're going with this. Inherently, I would say that no, I wouldn't. But I wouldn't really say that example is necessarily relevant, because I don't know of any kids under the age of 10 that actually learn polygon theory.
Oh, come on. You learn polygons and polygons in like year 2.
I mean, we're talking about basic shapes. Of course, you need to understand what basic shapes are. I mean, for just basic utility, if you point to something and say, I would like that, and it's a square, in theory, you should know that, right?
You don't need to say I need the square. You can just say that. You can extensively define. But the point is, right, even when they're in high school, you learn what parallelograms are. You don't need to know what parallelograms are. Like, the point is, it doesn't matter if the exact skill is useful in later life. It is the surrounding ethic about it and the surrounding way of your mind forms, which primes you to make it easier to learn things in the future, which is what I pointed to in my earlier points, right? Is that, sure, kids don't need to learn the exact nature of every game and every competition at the age of sub-10, but it sure as hell is easier to teach them right and wrong. It sure as hell is easier to teach them how to compete properly if they've already been practicing it for a very, very long time, when they have their own experiences to draw from, when they've heard the idioms, when they've got narratives in which your parents who have been to those games and seen the kids compete can say, here is an example of where things went too far, where they can learn how to make a mistake and how to be forgiven and how to forgive for those who transgress against them. It's important that kids act that out, because it makes it easier to learn those things into the future. Last thing was about how it teaches them bad things. I would say that when you're saying aggression, it's good if it's pointed in the right direction. Competition points it in the right direction, right? You're playing soccer, it channels your aggression towards the ball, right? It says that when you win and lose, that it's not about going up and socking the other person one, that it's how you play the game. It's making it so that they will come and play with you again. That's the good thing about competition, is that it actually does exactly what you're desiring. It points your aggression in the right direction. I don't believe that your assertion that it's all about winning. I already pointed out at the beginning, there are many, many idioms about not winning, how it's not all about winning, it's how you play the game, how that there's no I in team. And I think kids learn that very quickly, that if they win all the time, but nobody wants to play with them anymore, they stop getting invited and they've learned that it's not about winning. I'm good to give them that opportunity. I've realized I've sucked up all the time with our little back and forth, by the way, so I'll just give you the floor.
No problem. I was stalling them. Point wise, I'll hopefully quickly respond. The entire basis of my case is simply this: one, that we see a large chance of hurt, and that can go back and forth. Like, we can argue that adults shouldn't be playing sports, but that's really irrelevant. The idea is, will young kids would it be detrimental to them? And I think the overwhelming answer is yes. We see large amounts of energies in the young adult situation. I wouldn't say that, as your same point here, it's non-unique to point to that situation and say, well, in that situation, we should ban that. That's not really relevant to the debate. It's quite simply this: kids who play, there's not as much safety that needs to be focused. And so in this instance, competition-driven sports such as soccer have incited a lot of physical harm. That is an empirical fact. That basis right there shows that inherently that competition is detrimental. Overall, your other points about how being a motivator, how it inherently is helpful, I completely agree. It can be. But the entire point is that at an early age, competition is simply this to children: winning. What can we do to win, and what can we do to win often? I agree that in some instances, you're going to have to learn to work with the opponent so you can win more. But the inherent focus is on an arbitrary goal, something that doesn't actually bring real value. So ultimately, at that age, when you don't understand what's right and what's wrong, the motivation is incorrect. And with that, I rest my time to respond.
All good, man. It was a pleasure debating you, and welcome to
debating you as well. Thanks.
Yeah,
All right. Bye.